Margaret Chen noticed the pattern on a Tuesday. She was sitting in the sunroom of Evergreen Gardens, the kind of upscale retirement community that came with granite countertops, a wine bar, and enough amenities to make you forget you were essentially waiting around to die. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the steam rising from her green tea. She'd been reading the same page of her book for 20 minutes, distracted by the conversation happening 3 tables over. "It's for your own good, Mother," a woman in her 50s was saying, her voice dripping with the kind of patience that wasn't patient at all. "Dr. Hamlin says you need full-time supervision." The elderly woman being addressed looked confused, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped her coffee cup. "But I don't understand. I'm fine here. I have my friends, my routine. You're not fine. You forget things. You get confused. We found a lovely place that specializes in memory care." Margaret had heard this exact conversation 2 weeks ago, word for word, between different people. And then again, a month before that. She was still a prosecutor at heart, even though she'd retired 8 years ago at 72. Once you learned to spot patterns in criminal behavior, you couldn't just turn it off. The pattern here was too consistent to be coincidence. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Jennifer. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation. Can I come by tomorrow?" Margaret set down her tea. She'd been expecting this. The community room at Evergreen Gardens typically hosted bridge games and book clubs. That Thursday evening, it hosted something entirely different. Margaret had sent carefully worded notes to 4 other women, all residents she'd been observing. The invitation was vague enough to seem innocuous, but specific enough that the right people would understand. Regarding recent family concerns, 7 p.m., Community Room B, discretion appreciated. Diane Foster arrived first. At 78, she still had the ramrod posture of someone who'd spent 30 years on the bench as a federal judge. Her silver hair was cut short and sharp, like everything else about her. "Margaret Chen," Diane said, settling into a chair. "I wondered if you'd noticed." "Hard to miss," Margaret replied. The door opened again. Patricia Trish Kowalski wheeled herself in, her wheelchair barely slowing her down. At 81, she was the oldest in the group and had the kind of eyes that didn't miss anything. 25 years as a private investigator would do that to you. "This better be good," Trish said. "I'm missing Jeopardy." "It's always on at 7, said the woman behind her. That was Rose Washington, 75, impeccably dressed as always. She'd been a forensic accountant for 40 years, the kind who'd taken down white-collar criminals with spreadsheets and patience. The last to arrive was Vivian Park, 73, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She'd been the CEO of a tech company before selling it for a fortune 10 years ago. She kept her gray hair long and still wore the kind of minimalist black clothing that screamed Bay Area entrepreneur. "I got your note," Vivian said to Margaret. "And I'm guessing this isn't about starting a new book club." "No," Margaret said. "It's about why all of our families have suddenly decided we're incompetent." The room went quiet. Diane was the first to speak. "My son James called last week. Said he'd been talking to some care consultant who suggested I might need a higher level of supervision. That Evergreen Gardens wasn't equipped for someone with my needs." "What needs?" Rose asked. "Exactly. I'm fine. I walk 3 miles a day. I volunteer at the library. But suddenly there's this narrative that I'm declining." "My daughter-in-law," Trish said, her voice tight. "She's been very concerned about my medications. Brought me to see some new doctor who suggested I might be taking too many, that I seemed confused about which pills do what. I've been managing my own medications for 60 years, but now I'm suddenly incompetent?" Rose nodded slowly. "My nephew. He's got power of attorney, which was fine when it was just a precaution. But now he's talking about moving me to a facility with better medical oversight. And he's been meeting with some consultant I never heard of. Vivian crossed her arms. Let me guess. Your families all suddenly became concerned around the same time. And they've all been talking to helpful professionals who just happen to recommend major changes to your living situations. 5 heads nodded. Margaret pulled out a yellow legal pad, her preferred tool from decades of taking notes in courtrooms. Here's what I know. 3 months ago, a resident named Helen Brightwell was moved to a memory care facility by her family. She didn't have dementia. I played bridge with her twice a week, sharp as a tack. 2 months ago, another woman, Dorothy Marsh, same thing. Both families used the same arguments. Both mentioned consultants. Both ended up in expensive facilities that provide minimal freedom and maximum billing. How do you know this? Diane asked. I made some calls, visited Helen once. They've got her so medicated she barely knew who I was. Helen, who used to do the New York Times crossword in pen. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding and rage. So what are we saying here? Vivian asked. That there's some kind of coordinated scheme to declare elderly people incompetent and move them into facilities? Yes, Margaret said. And I think it's bigger than just evergreen gardens. I think it's a network. Trish leaned forward. Then we need to investigate. Agreed, Diane said. But carefully. If we're right, these people have already demonstrated they know how to manipulate families and the medical system. One wrong move and we end up exactly where they want us. Rose was already pulling out her tablet. I'll start with the money. Follow the financial incentives. These facilities don't come cheap, and someone's profiting. I'll track the people, Trish said. The consultants, the doctors, the facility administrators. Find the connections. I'll handle the legal framework, Diane added. See what guardianship and conservatorship cases have been filed in the county. Look for patterns. Vivian glanced at Margaret. And you two? I'll coordinate, Margaret said, and start building a case. If we're going to take this down, we need evidence that would hold up in court. What can I do? Vivian asked. I sold software, not exactly relevant here. You understand systems? Margaret said. You built a company from nothing, and I'm guessing you know your way around technology better than the rest of us combined. Vivian smiled for the first time. Fair point. I can do digital forensics, track communications, financial transactions, hidden connections. And I can set us up with secure channels so our own communications don't get intercepted. So we're doing this, Rose said. It wasn't a question. We're doing this, Margaret confirmed. But we need to be smart. We keep living our normal lives. We don't give anyone reason to think we're on to them. And we don't trust anyone outside this room until we know who's involved and who's not. What do we call ourselves? Trish asked. Diane smiled grimly. How about the Silver Years Syndicate? I like it, Margaret said. Now let's get to work. Rose Washington had always believed that money told the truth, even when people lied. Numbers didn't have agendas. They just existed, waiting for someone patient enough to follow them to their logical conclusions. She'd been at it for 3 days, working from her apartment with the kind of focus she used to bring to fraud investigations. Her dining table was covered in printouts, her laptop open to multiple browser tabs, a notebook filled with figures and arrows connecting different entities. The network was more sophisticated than she'd expected. It started with the consultants. They called themselves elder care facilitators or senior life advisors, and they weren't directly employed by any facility. They operated as independent contractors, which made them harder to track. But they all seemed to be referred by the same handful of doctors, and they all recommended the same handful of expensive facilities. Rose had tracked down financial records for 5 of these facilities across 3 states. On paper, they were owned by different LLCs, but when you dug deeper, the ownership structures all traced back to a web of holding companies. And at the center of that web was a private equity firm called Meridian Health Partners. Meridian specialized in senior living investments. They'd bought up nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and memory care units across the eastern United States, consolidated them, cut costs, and raised prices. It was a profitable model, very profitable. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was the referral fees. Rose had gotten access to some leaked documents from a former employee of one of the facilities. Nothing admissible in court, not yet, but enough to see the shape of the scheme. The consultants received substantial payments for each resident they referred. The doctors who recommended the consultants also received consulting fees from Meridian. And in some cases, family members were getting kickbacks too, disguised as caregiver compensation. It was elegant in a deeply disturbing way. Create a crisis, offer a solution, profit from the fear and confusion. Rose called Margaret. "I've got the financial structure mapped out," she said. "It's a referral scheme, but bigger than I initially thought. We're talking millions of dollars across multiple states. Can you prove it?" Margaret asked. "Not yet, but I know where to look. I need access to more records. Bank statements, contracts, communication between the consultants and the facilities. That's going to be difficult to get legally. I know. But there might be another way. Some of these facilities are required to file financial disclosures because they accept Medicare and Medicaid. Those are public records. And if I can establish a pattern of fraud in the billing, that opens the door to subpoenas. Good. Write up everything you have. We'll need it. Margaret, one more thing. I found Helen Brightwell's financial records. Her family sold her house 3 months ago. The proceeds went into an account controlled by her son-in-law. Helen isn't even a signatory on the account. Margaret was quiet for a moment. How much? House sold for $850,000. Most of it is gone now. Transferred out in chunks to various accounts. They stole from her. Yes, Rose said. And I'm willing to bet she's not the only one. Trish Kowalski had spent most of her adult life following people who didn't want to be followed. The wheelchair actually made it easier now. People didn't see her as a threat. They saw an old woman, dismissed her, and that was exactly how she liked it. She'd been tailing one of the consultants for 2 days. His name was Derek Marshall, mid-40s, expensive suit, briefcase full of pamphlets about senior care options. He'd been to Evergreen Gardens twice in the past month, meeting with families in the private visiting rooms. Trish had taken photos of everyone he met with. She'd also managed to get close enough to overhear parts of his pitch. It was smooth. He never came right out and said the elderly person was incompetent. He just asked questions designed to plant doubt. Have you noticed any memory issues? Sometimes they're subtle. Is she managing her medications correctly? What happens if there's an emergency and she can't get help? Derek Marshall was good at his job, which made him dangerous. After leaving Evergreen, Derek drove to a medical office in a professional complex 20 minutes away. Trish followed at a careful distance. She watched him go inside, emerging 40 minutes later with a doctor she recognized from her research. Dr. Philip Hamlin, the same doctor mentioned in several of the cases they were tracking. They stood outside talking for a few minutes. Trish got photos from the parking lot, zoomed in enough to catch their faces clearly. Then Derek handed the doctor an envelope. Not a briefcase, not a folder, an envelope. The kind of thing you use for cash. Trish called Margaret immediately. I've got photographic evidence of Marshall paying off Dr. Hamlin. Can you prove what was in the envelope? No, but I can prove they met, and I've got them on camera exchanging something. Combined with Rose's financial data showing Hamlin receiving consulting fees, it builds a pattern. Good work. Keep on, Marshall. See where else he goes, who else he meets with. Over the next week, Trish expanded her surveillance. She roped in some of her old contacts, retired investigators who owed her favors or were bored enough to help for free. Together, they mapped out the network. There were 5 consultants operating in their area. All of them met regularly with the same group of doctors. All of them referred to the same facilities. And all of them seemed to coordinate through a woman named Sandra Vega, who ran something called Senior Advocacy Services. Sandra Vega became Trish's new focus. She was harder to follow. She didn't keep regular hours, didn't have a predictable routine. But Trish was patient. On the 7th day of surveillance, Sandra met with someone interesting, a lawyer named Howard Brenner who specialized in conservatorships and guardianships. Trish got photos of that meeting too. When she showed them to Diane, the former judge went pale. "I know Howard Brenner," Diane said. "He's appeared in my courtroom dozens of times. He's filed more guardianship petitions than any other attorney in the county." Is that normal? No. Most attorneys handle maybe a handful of these cases a year. They're time-consuming and don't pay particularly well unless... Diane trailed off. "Unless you're getting paid by someone else to file them," Trish finished. "Exactly. And if he's working with this network, he's the one initiating the legal process to strip people of their rights." Margaret looked at the photos spread across her dining table. The connections were becoming clearer. Consultants identified targets. Doctors provided medical justification. Lawyers filed the legal paperwork. Facilities collected the payments. And families, convinced they were doing the right thing, went along with it. "We need to get inside one of these facilities," Margaret said. "We need to talk to the residents, see what's actually happening to them." "That's going to be tricky," Vivian said. She'd been quiet during most of the meeting, working on her laptop. "These places have strict visitor policies, and if we start asking questions, we'll tip them off." "What if we don't ask questions?" Rose suggested. "What if we just listen?" "What do you mean?" Rose smiled. "Most of these facilities hire aides and nurses who are overworked and underpaid. People talk, especially to someone who seems sympathetic. I could pose as a potential employee." "You're 75, Trish pointed out, "and there's a nursing shortage. Some of these places are desperate enough to hire anyone with a pulse. I could say I'm looking for part-time work, just a few shifts a week. Get inside, talk to the staff, see what they know." Margaret considered it. "It's risky." "Everything we're doing is risky," Rose replied. "But we need inside information. And this is the best way to get it." "Do it," Margaret said. "But be careful. If they figure out who you are, you could end up as a resident yourself." Rose's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let them try." Rose spent a week preparing. She created a fake resume with real references from former colleagues who owed her favors. She studied up on basic nursing care, enough to sound plausible. And she picked her target facility carefully. Willowbrook Memory Care, one of the places that had received multiple referrals from Derek Marshall. The interview was almost insultingly easy. The HR manager, a frazzled woman in her 30s, barely glanced at her resume. "You have caregiving experience?" "I took care of my mother for 5 years before she passed," Rose lied smoothly. "And I'm looking for something meaningful to do with my retirement." "Can you work overnight shifts?" "That's where we're most short-staffed." "Absolutely." "When can you start?" 3 days later, Rose was wearing scrubs and a name tag that said Rose Wilson, working the night shift at Willowbrook. She was assigned to the memory care wing, a locked unit on the 2nd floor. The first thing she noticed was how many residents seemed confused, but not actually impaired. The second thing she noticed was the medication carts. They were wheeled through every few hours, and the residents were given pills without much explanation. "What is that?" Rose asked another aide, a young woman named Tasha, who seemed slightly more awake than the rest of the exhausted staff. "Ativan, mostly. Sometimes Haldol. Keeps them calm. Do they all need it?" Tasha shrugged. "Doctor's orders. We just follow the med sheets." Rose checked the medication logs when no one was looking. Almost every resident was on some combination of sedatives and antipsychotics, far more than seemed medically necessary. Over the course of several shifts, Rose started talking to the residents during quiet moments. Many of them were lucid enough to hold conversations, though they seemed foggy and disconnected. One woman, Mrs. Brennan, grabbed Rose's hand during a medication round. "I don't want to take that," she said. "It makes me feel strange." "It's doctor's orders," Rose said gently, then lowered her voice. "Why do you think you're here?" "My daughter said I needed help, but I was fine. I lived alone for 10 years after my husband died. I took care of everything. Now I can't even go to the bathroom without asking permission." "Do you ever see your daughter?" Mrs. Brennan's eyes filled with tears. "Not since they brought me here. She said she'd visit, but that was 3 months ago." Rose documented everything. The over-medication, the isolation, the residents who seemed to have no legitimate reason to be in memory care. She took photos of medication logs when she could, careful to never show faces or identifying information. On her 5th shift, she overheard a conversation between the facility director and Dr. Hamlin. They were in the office, door slightly ajar, and Rose was in the hallway pretending to check her phone. "We're at capacity," the director was saying. "We need to move some of the Medicaid residents to the state facility to make room for more private pay." "Already working on it," Dr. Hamlin replied. "I've got 3 assessments scheduled this week. We'll find medical justification for the transfers." "Good. Meridian wants to see our revenue numbers improve. Private pay residents are the priority." Rose's blood went cold. They were deliberately moving out residents who couldn't pay as much, regardless of their actual medical needs, to make room for wealthier victims. She waited until her shift ended, then drove straight to Margaret's apartment. "We need to get these people out," Rose said, her hands shaking as she handed over her documentation. "What they're doing isn't just fraud, it's abuse. These residents are being drugged into compliance and isolated from their families." Margaret read through the notes, her face hardening with each page. "This is enough. Combined with Trish's surveillance and my case file, we can take this to the authorities." "Which authorities?" Vivian asked. She'd been working on mapping the digital connections and had joined the emergency meeting. "We don't know who's compromised. If this network is as big as we think, they might have connections in law enforcement, adult protective services, even the courts." Diane nodded slowly. "She's right. Guardianship and conservatorship cases go through probate court. If there are judges who are part of this or looking the other way, bringing evidence to the wrong person could get it buried." "So what do we do?" Rose asked. Margaret thought for a moment. "We go bigger, federal. If this crosses state lines, it's wire fraud, racketeering, maybe even organized crime. We take it to the FBI. Will they listen to 5 old women?" Trish asked. "They will if we give them a case they can't ignore," Margaret replied. "We've got financial records, surveillance photos, testimony from inside a facility, and a pattern of behavior across multiple states. We just need one more thing." "What?" "A victim willing to go on record. Someone who can testify about what happened to them and their family. Someone sympathetic and credible." They all looked at each other. "Helen Brightwell," Diane said. "If we can get her out of that facility and get her story, she could be the face of this. A respectable woman with no history of cognitive decline, trapped in a memory care unit and robbed by her own family. "How do we get her out?" Vivian asked. "We don't," Margaret said. "Not yet. First, we need to make sure we have all the evidence we need. Then we need to contact someone at the federal level who we can trust. Someone who can't be bought off or intimidated." "I know someone," Diane said. "Assistant U.S. attorney I worked with years ago. Good person. Honest. If anyone will take this seriously, she will." "Make the call," Margaret said. "Tell her we have evidence of a multi-state elder fraud scheme and we need to meet. Somewhere secure, somewhere we can't be overheard." Diane pulled out her phone. On it. As she stepped out of the room to make the call, the others sat in silence. They'd started this thinking it was just about protecting themselves. Now they realized they'd stumbled onto something much bigger, something that was destroying lives across multiple states. "Are we sure about this?" Rose asked quietly. "Once we go to the FBI, there's no going back. These people will know we're onto them." "I'm sure," Margaret said. "We didn't spend our entire careers fighting for justice just to roll over when it's our own rights on the line. And we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for Helen, for Mrs. Brennan, for every person trapped in this system." Trish nodded. "Then let's finish this." Vivian Park was not accustomed to feeling helpless. She'd built a company from scratch, survived 3 rounds of venture capital funding, and sold for enough money that she'd never have to work again. She was used to being in control. This was different. Her daughter, Emily, had been calling every day. The conversations followed the same script. Concern about Vivian's health, suggestions that she might need more support, references to conversations with a consultant Emily had met. Vivian knew exactly what was happening. She was being set up. The question was whether Emily was a victim or a participant. Vivian wanted to believe her daughter was being manipulated, that she genuinely thought she was helping. But the alternative was that Emily knew exactly what she was doing, that she'd been offered money to go along with the scheme. Vivian didn't want to believe that. But she'd been in business long enough to know that people did terrible things when money was involved. She decided to test it. "Emily," Vivian said during their next call, "I want to understand what you're concerned about. Can you give me specific examples of things I've done that worry you?" There was a pause. "Well, you forget things sometimes. Everyone forgets things." "What specifically have I forgotten?" Another pause. "I don't know, Mom. It's just a general sense. The consultant said sometimes family members are the last to notice the signs." "What consultant?" "I'd like to talk to them. Her name is Angela. She specializes in helping families transition elderly relatives to appropriate care." "I don't need care. I'm healthy. I see my doctor regularly. I'm not confused or forgetful beyond what's normal for someone my age." "Mom, I'm just trying to help. Are you? Or is someone paying you to help?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Emily," Vivian said, her voice cold, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I know what's happening. I know there's a scheme targeting elderly people, convincing families to have them declared incompetent and moved to expensive facilities. I know consultants and doctors are getting paid to facilitate this, and I know that family members sometimes get compensation for going along with it. Mom, that's crazy. Nobody's paying me anything. Then explain to me why you've suddenly decided I need full-time care when nothing about my situation has changed. Explain why you're taking advice from a stranger instead of my own doctors. Explain why you're pushing this so hard, because I'm worried about you." "No," Vivian said. "You're worried about your inheritance, and someone has convinced you that you need to act now to protect it or to get access to it sooner. But here's what you need to understand. I'm not incompetent. I'm not confused, and I'm not alone. There are other people who know what's happening, and we're going to stop it. If you're part of this, you need to walk away now before you end up in prison." She hung up before Emily could respond. Vivian's hands were shaking. She wanted to believe she'd gotten through to her daughter, that Emily would realize she was being used and back off. But she couldn't be certain. She called Margaret. "My daughter's been compromised," Vivian said. "She's working with them." "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but sure enough." "What do I do?" "Document everything. Record your conversations with her if you can. We need to show that family members are being recruited as part of the scheme. It strengthens the case." "This is my daughter, Margaret." "I know. I'm sorry, but if she's part of this, she needs to face the consequences. And if she's being manipulated, helping us expose the people manipulating her is the best thing you can do for her." Vivian closed her eyes. "When did everything get so complicated?" "When we decided to grow old in a society that sees us as problems to be managed instead of people to be respected," Margaret replied. "But we're going to change that." After hanging up, Vivian opened her laptop. If her daughter was working with the network, there would be digital evidence: emails, texts, bank transfers. Vivian had spent years understanding systems and how to find vulnerabilities in them. She could do this. She started with Emily's social media, looking for connections. There, a friend request from Angela Summers 6 months ago. Angela's profile was sparse but professional. Senior care consultant, helping families navigate difficult transitions. Vivian dug deeper, using tools she'd learned about from her years in tech. She found Angela's business registration. It was filed under Sandra Vega's Senior Advocacy Services, so Emily was connected directly to the network's coordinator. Vivian kept digging. She found email exchanges between Emily and Angela, recovered from a backup of Emily's laptop that synced to a family-shared drive Vivian still had access to. The emails were damning. "Your mother's assets are substantial. If she's declared incompetent, you'll have control through conservatorship. I can help facilitate that process. There are professionals I work with who can provide the necessary medical documentation." Emily's response: "I don't know." "This feels wrong," Angela's reply. "I understand your hesitation, but consider this. Your mother is elderly and vulnerable. What happens if she makes poor financial decisions? What if someone takes advantage of her? You're not stealing from her. You're protecting her interests and your family's future. And there's a modest compensation for families who work with us to offset the time and stress of managing a conservatorship." "How much?" 10% of assets transferred into managed care accounts. In your mother's case, that would be approximately $200,000. Vivian felt sick. Her own daughter had been offered a bribe to have her declared incompetent, and Emily had at least considered it. She forwarded everything to Margaret, then sat in her darkened apartment staring at nothing. She'd built her entire life on the principle that hard work and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. She'd never imagined the obstacle would be her own family. Her phone rang. It was Emily. Vivian let it go to voicemail. Diane Foster had spent 30 years on the federal bench. She'd seen humanity at its best and worst, had ruled on cases that shaped people's lives, had tried to always come down on the side of justice. She'd thought she understood the system, how it worked, where its weaknesses were. Now she realized she'd been naive. Conservatorship and guardianship cases were typically handled at the state level, in probate court. Diane had never specialized in that area, had never paid much attention to it. It seemed straightforward. If someone was incapable of managing their own affairs, the court appointed someone to do it for them. But when she started digging into the cases filed in their county over the past 3 years, she found something disturbing. Howard Brenner, the lawyer Trish had photographed meeting with Sandra Vega, had filed 127 guardianship petitions in 3 years. That was roughly one every 8 days. and his success rate was astronomical. 92% of his petitions were granted. That wasn't normal. In a legitimate system, you'd expect some petitions to be denied, some to be withdrawn, some to be contested. But Brenner's cases sailed through with minimal opposition. Diane pulled the case files, which were public record. She spent days reading through them, looking for patterns. The pattern was obvious once she knew what to look for. Nearly all of Brenner's petitions followed the same structure. A family member would petition for guardianship, citing concerns about the elderly person's capacity. Medical evidence would be provided by one of a handful of doctors, usually Dr. Hamlin or Dr. Susan Chu or Dr. Richard Torres. The elderly person would either not contest the petition or would appear in court seeming confused and disoriented. Diane pulled the court transcripts. In several cases, the elderly person had objected to the guardianship but had been overruled based on medical testimony. In one case, a woman named Ruth Sorensen had told the judge, "I don't understand why I'm here. I'm not sick. I don't need a guardian." The medical testimony claimed she had advancing dementia and lacked insight into her condition. The judge had granted the petition. Diane found Ruth's address and drove to see her. She was in a facility called Meadow Rest, another property owned by Meridian Health Partners. The staff wouldn't let Diane visit without being on Ruth's approved visitor list. Diane pulled out her phone and called the facility director. "This is Judge Diane Foster, retired from the federal bench. I need to speak with Ruth Sorensen regarding a legal matter. I can get a court order if necessary, but I'd prefer to avoid that." The title still carried weight. 15 minutes later, Diane was sitting across from Ruth in a small visiting room. Ruth was 79, thin, and looked tired. But her eyes were clear and sharp. "Who are you?" Ruth asked. "My name is Diane Foster. I'm a retired judge. I've been looking into how you ended up here." "I don't know how I ended up here," Ruth said. "One day I was in my house, the next I was in court, then I was here. They told me I have dementia. But I don't feel like I have dementia. I remember things. I know where I am. I know I don't want to be here." "Who brought the guardianship petition?" "My nephew, Carl. He said it was for my own good. But I haven't seen him since the court hearing. The staff says he's busy." "How often does he visit?" "He doesn't. And when I try to call him, they tell me the phone is being repaired or it's not a good time. I'm allowed one phone call a week, and I have to schedule it in advance." Diane felt her anger rising. "Do you have other family?" "A sister in Oregon, but I haven't been able to reach her. They say she knows where I am, but I don't think she does. Betty would come get me if she knew." "What's Betty's full name?" "Elizabeth Sorensen Greenfield. She lives in Portland." Diane made a note. "Ruth, I'm going to look into this. But I need to ask you some questions to understand what's happening. Is that okay?" "Yes, please. I'll answer anything." Over the next hour, Diane asked Ruth detailed questions about her memory, her daily activities before the guardianship, her medical history. Ruth answered everything clearly and accurately. She had no signs of dementia, no cognitive impairment beyond normal age-related slowing. When Diane left, she was furious. Ruth Sorensen had been stolen from her life and locked away, all with the blessing of the legal system. And if it happened to Ruth, it had happened to dozens of others. She called Betty Greenfield that evening. "Ms. Greenfield, my name is Diane Foster. I'm calling about your sister, Ruth Sorensen." "Oh my God, is Ruth okay?" "I haven't heard from her in months. Her nephew said she was in a memory care facility, but he wouldn't tell me where. He said she didn't want visitors because it upset her." "That's not true. Ruth very much wants to see you. She's being held at a facility called Meadow Rest, and I don't believe she should be there." Betty was crying. I knew something was wrong. Carl wouldn't answer my questions. He kept saying he had power of attorney and was handling everything. But Ruth wouldn't have wanted this. She was independent. She lived alone, managed her own affairs. Ms. Greenfield, I need to ask you something. Do you know what happened to Ruth's house? Carl said he sold it to pay for her care. But Ruth owned that house outright. It was worth at least $600,000. How much can a care facility possibly cost? More than you'd think, Diane said grimly. Especially when